In 1989 and 1990, I worked as a naturalist guide aboard a cruise ship in the Galapagos Islands. I've often been asked what the experience was like, and to answer that question, I've made this video series. It's a photographic chronicle of that experience, made 20 years later. Despite not being much of a shutterbug, I or my passengers took most of the photographs you'll see, supplemented with some photos from the web where needed. And I had the good fortune to have a passenger who not only filmed his trip, but sent me a copy of the tape. But first, a brief history. In 1985, I graduated with a degree in English and Evolution from the Colorado College in Colorado Springs. I was the first at my school to graduate with the newly introduced thematic minor on evolution, which covered a general education in many fields related to evolution rather than the more typical in-depth coverage within a narrow field. I took more courses in my minor than my major, but I never thought I would actually have a professional use for it. However, a few years later, my father invited me on a trip to the Galapagos Islands. The boat we chartered leaked badly in rough seas and the food was monotonous, but I had a terrific time. I also learned that a guide must accompany anyone wishing to visit most of the islands, and it occurred to me that I had the perfect prerequisite to become one: a degree in evolution. I also lived for a while in Quito, Ecuador, where I had a girlfriend who turned out to have worked as a public relations officer aboard one of the cruise ships in the Galapagos Islands. She put me in contact with the owners of the cruise ship company, and in the summer of 1989, they hired me on. Right after I arrived at the company's main office in Guayaquil, Ecuador, they flew me out to their cruise ship, the Galapagos Explorer, where I spent my first week assisting one of the regular guides to familiarize myself with the job. They then dropped me and a few other guides off in the town of Puerto Ayora on Santa Cruz Island, where we began the intense month-long naturalist guide course at the Charles Darwin Research Station. There we studied the biology, geology, geography, oceanography, meteorology, and history of the Galapagos Islands, as well as learned how to guide and act as park rangers. Despite my rudimentary Spanish at the time, I passed the course and immediately started in as one of a couple dozen of the more extensively trained naturalist guides working on the islands at any one time. I spent the majority of the next year guiding aboard the Galapagos Explorer. We always had 5 to 7 naturalist guides on duty at any one time on the ship. Our weekly schedule started with transporting our up to 90 passengers to Puerto Bacarizo Moreno on San Cristobal Island. This was usually uneventful, although on one occasion we spotted a female killer whale and her calf cavorting in the bay only a stone's throw from our ship. Once we had everyone on land, one guide would charter a small bus and take those passengers staying with us from the previous cruise from the dry desert coast up to the rainforest highlands. They would then hike up to El Junco, the only permanent freshwater lake in Galapagos. Cold, wet, and with a view usually shrouded in fog, this was my least favorite excursion. But often we would see flying frigate birds dipping their bills to take a sip of water, and when the fog cleared, the view of nearly the whole island could be impressive. The other guides would take the rest of the passengers to the airport and see them off, and greet the newly arriving passengers. We would ferry them to the Galapagos Explorer, divide them into groups of around 14 passengers each, and assign a guide to each group. We would then give them an orientation on shipboard procedures and the daily excursions. Even though I was a rookie, I was the only native English speaker, and most passengers spoke English, plus I enjoyed public speaking, so I soon ended up giving most of the orientations. By the time everyone was settled in and fed a late lunch, there wasn't much daylight left. However, the ship headed to nearby Kicker Rock, where we would take the passengers out in our 14-passenger boats, called pangas, to view the impressive jutting structure with its constantly circling seabird companions. On rare occasions, during low tide and especially calm seas, we would send the pangas through the narrow gap between the two rocks, which could get hairy when a sudden swell passed through the opening and threatened to jam the pangas between the rocks. Then we would return and get ready for dinner. The meals on board were generally okay, but nothing like typical fancy cruise ship fare. Afterward, we would introduce the guides and some of the crew to the newly arrived passengers, and every evening we would give the passengers a slideshow of what to expect during the next day's excursions. During the first night, the Galapagos Explorer would travel south to Hood, or Española Island. Most of the islands have 2 or 3 names. After breakfast the next day, we guides would ferry our groups of passengers by panga to Hood's Punta Suarez. Then we would lead them along a marked trail around the island to view the wildlife, plants, and geology. Some passengers don't appreciate the requirement to stay on the trails, but in the Galapagos that's usually not much of a restriction, since many of the animals sit and even nest right on the trails. Hood is a flat, dry island of upthrust rock. Passengers disembarking from the pangas are usually met by curious sea lions, which are found all over the island coasts. Like most animals in the Galapagos, this smaller subspecies of the California sea lion has little fear of humans. Visitors must inevitably walk around and even over many of the animals. Here we see the world's only marine lizard, the marine iguana. These iguanas are endemic to the Galapagos Islands, but are found on all the island coasts. They evolved from the mainland green iguana and survived by feeding on seaweed. Larger specimens are capable of swimming underwater over 15 meters deep and staying submerged for up to an hour, although they usually stay down just a few minutes at a time. Being reptiles, they're cold-blooded and cool off rapidly in the ocean, but they've evolved black skin to help them warm up rapidly in the sun. The hood subspecies is the most colorful, with the males developing bright red and green markings during the breeding season. Hood is also home to a large population of the comical blue-footed booby. Found on many of the islands, these boobies dive for fish close to shore. As you can see here, their nests are little more than a slight depression in the ground. This unfortunate booby managed to select a popular marine iguana hangout for its nesting site. Here I tell my passengers a little bit about the bluefoots.
What we have over here is a pair of blue-footed boobies, and the way to distinguish the male from the female is one way is look at the pupils. You notice that two different pupil sizes. The male has a small pupil, the female has a large pupil. It's not really that hers is any larger, it just has a black eye ring around it. In addition, the female is slightly larger, and her sound is quite a bit different. She makes a honking sound, and the male makes a whistling sound. Sort of a complaining honk sounds like wah, 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 and the male makes a sound.
The masked booby also nests on Hood and other islands. This brilliantly white bird is the largest of the boobies. It fishes further out to sea than the bluefoots. Although masked boobies lay 2 eggs in their simple nests, only one ever survives. The first chick to hatch always kills the second, unless it dies before the second hatches. It's a way of ensuring at least one survivor. Here you can see a breeding pair of masked boobies. I rarely saw the third booby species, the red-footed booby, even though it's actually the most numerous, because it feeds far out to sea and nests in locations we never visited. I did, however, see one close up on Hood, and another that perched for a while on the Galapagos Explorer. We'd often see the elegant red-billed tropic bird flying near the shore, however. We'd also see it on several other islands. Also on Hood and other islands we'd see the beautiful Galapagos dove with its bright red feet and brilliant blue eye ring. Unfortunately, this bird is delicious, and its utter lack of fear made it an easy meal for sailors before the islands were protected. It's still pretty fearless, but more skittish now than it used to be. Hood also has the breeding colony for almost the entire world population of waved albatrosses. These majestic birds can have wingspans of over 2 meters. They mate for life, and they can live perhaps 50 years. They nest on the bare ground and are known for their elaborate bill-clacking courtship display. Curiously, the waved albatrosses will often roll their huge eggs to different locations. Blue-footed boobies have been known to steal their eggs and try, unsuccessfully, to incubate them. A favorite geological feature of Hood is the blowhole. Waves channeled into a narrow gap in the rocks explode upward. High tide and rough seas make for a particularly dramatic display. Visitors from small boats without bathing facilities often use it as a shower. The Galapagos is home to several species of predatory endemic mockingbirds, too. The Hood mockingbird is particularly fearless. This one amusingly landed on a panga's ladder, hopped on board, and took a seat as if it were the next passenger in line.